There's a pattern most empaths notice, but can't explain. You meet someone. At first, everything feels natural, easy, aligned. But over time, something shifts. The same types of people keep showing up, draining, manipulative, emotionally heavy. And eventually you start asking yourself, why does this keep happening to me? Is it bad luck? Is it timing? Or is there something about you that attracts it? Before we go deeper, if you connect with this kind of psychological content, make sure to subscribe to the channel because we explore things most people don't really notice. And if anything in this video feels familiar or relates to your experience, drop a comment below and share it with me. I read them and it helps me understand your perspective better. Now, let's get into it. Most empaths believe the problem is external. They think, I just meet the wrong people. I just have bad experiences. But that explanation is incomplete because patterns don't repeat randomly. If the same type of person keeps entering your life, there's a mechanism behind it. Not something mystical, something psychological. And once you understand it, the pattern stops feeling confusing and starts feeling predictable. Let's clarify something first. When we say aura, we're not talking about something mystical or invisible floating around a person. We're talking about signals, subtle, but very real psychological and behavioral signals that people pick up on instantly, even if they can't explain how. It starts with your body language, the way you stand, the way you move, the way you react in conversation. Then it goes deeper, your tone of voice, your pace of speaking, your emotional openness, your level of comfort around others, your responsiveness to what people say or feel. All of these things combine together into something that creates a readable presence. And most people don't realize they are constantly reading it. It happens automatically, below conscious awareness. They don't think, I'm analyzing this person. They just feel something about them. Empaths tend to project a very specific kind of signal, often without even trying. Warmth, openness, emotional availability, a sense of understanding, and low resistance in interaction. They don't usually come across as guarded or closed off. They feel approachable, emotionally safe. And to the right kind of person, this is exactly what creates connection. It feels calm. It feels accepting. It feels like being understood without effort. But here's where the problem starts. The same signals that feel safe to emotionally healthy people can feel very different to the wrong kind of person. Because low resistance and high openness don't just communicate safety, they can also communicate accessibility. Not access in a respectful sense, but access without boundaries. And that is where misunderstanding begins. What feels like emotional warmth from an empath can be interpreted as emotional availability that has no limits. And that interpretation changes how people approach them. Here's something uncomfortable but real. Toxic people are often far more observant than most people assume. Not in a deliberate analytical way, but in an instinctive, almost automatic way. They don't sit and think about who to target. They simply read people. They pick up on behavioral patterns, emotional reactions, and subtle cues within seconds of interaction. And without even realizing it consciously, they start scanning for specific traits. Who will listen without interrupting or pushing back? Who will give without asking too many questions? Who will understand without demanding accountability? Who will tolerate discomfort instead of walking away? These are not random observations for them. They are indicators of how far a person can be influenced, tested, or emotionally engaged. And this is where empaths often enter the picture. Because empaths naturally tend to show many of these signals. Not because they lack strength, but because their default setting is openness. They listen deeply. They try to understand before judging. They give emotional space to others. They often prioritize connection over confrontation. And in healthy environments, these are powerful traits. but in unhealthy dynamics, they are interpreted differently. Openness, when combined with weak or unclear boundaries, doesn't just look like kindness, it starts to look like opportunity. Opportunity for emotional reliance, opportunity for inconsistency to be tolerated, opportunity for limits to be tested slowly over time. And the key issue is this: toxic individuals rarely see openness as something to respect. They see it as something that can be gradually expanded, not all at once, but step by step. And empaths, without realizing it, often respond in ways that reinforce this pattern, because their instinct is to understand, not to resist. And that is where the dynamic quietly begins. Attraction is not always as simple as liking someone. In reality, human connection often works on multiple layers, and not all of them are emotional or healthy. Sometimes attraction is not about affection at all. It's about usefulness. And this is where the dynamic becomes uncomfortable to look at, because many people are not actually drawn to empaths for genuine connection or mutual understanding. They are drawn for something more unconscious: regulation. They are looking for someone who can absorb emotional pressure that they themselves cannot hold. Someone who can sit with their chaos without leaving. Someone who can stabilize their emotional instability in real time. Someone who can validate their shifting moods, contradictions, and inconsistencies without judgment. And empaths, without even realizing it, often become the perfect match for this pattern, not because they are trying to be used, but because their natural behavior already aligns with what the other person needs. They listen more than they speak. They try to understand instead of confront. They absorb emotional intensity instead of rejecting it. They stay longer in discomfort than most people would. And over time, this creates a subtle but powerful loop. A pattern begins to form. The more the empath gives emotionally, the more the other person learns they can take. Not necessarily in a conscious or malicious way at first, but as a learned dynamic. A system gets created between the two people. One side regulates, the other side provides regulation, and the imbalance slowly becomes normal. What makes this especially difficult is that it doesn't feel wrong in the beginning. It often feels like connection. But over time, the emotional weight becomes one-sided, and the empath starts realizing that their presence is not just being appreciated, it is being relied upon in ways they never intentionally agreed to. Here's where the dynamic stops being just external and starts becoming internal. Because for many empaths, something subtle develops over time that they don't consciously notice. They begin to tie their sense of value to being needed. Not in an obvious or intentional way, but in an emotional way that feels natural to them. When they are helping someone, they feel useful. When they are supporting someone, they feel important. When they are understanding someone's pain, they feel connected. And slowly, these emotional experiences start forming an internal pattern. That being needed equals being valuable. And this is where a hidden psychological trap begins to form. Because the more a person depends on the feeling of being needed to feel worthy, the more their behavior starts aligning with situations where they are needed. And not in healthy, balanced ways, but in emotionally demanding ones. This is where attraction becomes complicated, because instead of naturally connecting with stable, self-aware people, they often find themselves around individuals who are emotionally unstable, inconsistent, or internally unregulated. Not because they are choosing it consciously, but because those are the environments where their value system feels activated. People who don't need fixing don't trigger the same internal response, but people who are struggling emotionally do. So over time, a pattern develops. The empath becomes the fixer, the listener, the emotional supporter, the stabilizing presence, And the more this role is repeated, the more it feels familiar. And familiarity starts to feel like identity. But the deeper issue is this. This dynamic doesn't lead to balanced relationships. It leads to emotional labor, where one person is constantly processing, holding, and regulating emotions, while the other simply receives. And because the need to feel needed is not conscious, it becomes very difficult to recognize when the pattern is actually unhealthy. Until exhaustion begins to show up, not suddenly, but slowly, through emotional depletion that is hard to explain but impossible to ignore. For many empaths, boundaries don't feel like a natural behavior at first, not because they don't understand the concept, but because emotionally it feels uncomfortable to apply it. There is a difference between knowing something intellectually and being able to execute it emotionally in real situations. Empaths often fall into that gap. They can recognize that boundaries are important, healthy, and necessary, but when it comes to actually enforcing them in real interactions, something internal hesitates. Saying no doesn't just feel like a response. It feels like rejection. It feels like distance. It feels like hurting someone. And that emotional interpretation creates resistance. Pulling back even slightly can feel wrong, almost like they are doing something unkind, even when they are simply trying to protect their own space. So instead of clearly setting limits, many empaths unconsciously choose a different path. They stretch themselves. They extend their patience. They extend their understanding. They extend their emotional availability beyond what is comfortable. And over time, this stretching becomes noticeable in the way they respond to others. Because people, even without conscious awareness, pick up on it. And this is where an important psychological signal is sent. When someone repeatedly does not enforce limits, the message that is received is not about kindness alone. It becomes something more behavioral. This person is flexible. This person will adjust. This person will not stop me easily. And once that signal is communicated, it doesn't disappear. It gets stored in the dynamic between both people. Because human behavior adapts based on feedback loops. If boundaries are not clearly enforced, the expectation of access quietly increases. Not always in an obvious or aggressive way, but gradually through repetition. And this is why the absence of boundaries often creates more imbalance over time. Not because empaths lack strength, but because their strength is often expressed through tolerance rather than restriction. Over time, the dynamic doesn't stay the same. It slowly shifts. Not in a dramatic moment, but in small emotional increments that are easy to ignore at first. The empath begins to feel it internally. A sense of fatigue, mental heaviness, emotional overload that is hard to explain, but very real to experience. It doesn't always show up as chaos. Sometimes it shows up as quiet exhaustion. But instead of recognizing it as a signal to pause, they often do the opposite. They try harder. They invest more energy into understanding the situation. They give more emotional space. They explain themselves more clearly. They try to fix misunderstandings more quickly. Because in their mind, there is still a belief that if they just adjust enough, things will eventually balance out. If they become more patient, more understanding, more emotionally available, the relationship will stabilize. But what they slowly begin to realize is something uncomfortable. The imbalance is not happening because of lack of effort. It is happening because the foundation itself was never equal to begin with. One side is constantly regulating, adapting, and absorbing, while the other side continues receiving without the same level of emotional responsibility. And this is where the draining phase becomes more noticeable. Because the empath is not just giving anymore, they are compensating. compensating for emotional inconsistency, compensating for lack of reciprocity, compensating for imbalance that was never addressed early on. And the more they try to fix it, the more they reinforce the cycle, until eventually effort no longer feels like connection. It starts to feel like maintenance. And emotional maintenance without balance always leads to depletion. Not immediately, but gradually, in a way that becomes impossible to ignore over time. This is the hardest truth to accept, because at first glance it feels like bad luck, like coincidence, like different people showing up in the same way over and over again. But when you look deeper into patterns, something more uncomfortable becomes visible. It repeats because it works. Not in a positive sense, but in a functional sense. It works for the other side of the dynamic, not necessarily for you, for them. Because every repeated pattern in human behavior is reinforced by outcome. If a certain interaction keeps producing results for one person, emotional support, attention, understanding, patience, or access, then that pattern becomes stabilized, even if it is unbalanced, even if it is unhealthy, even if it slowly drains the other person. As long as the system continues to produce benefit for one side, there is no internal reason for that behavior to change. And this is where empaths often miss the deeper mechanism. They tend to focus on intention. But patterns are not driven by intention alone. They are driven by reinforcement. So if the empath continues to respond with understanding, continues to give emotional space, continues to stay present even when things feel uneven, then the pattern does not break. It strengthens. Not because anyone is consciously trying to take advantage, but because the structure of the interaction remains unchanged. And over time, the empath begins to feel confused, wondering why the same emotional experience keeps repeating with different people. But the external faces are not the real issue. The internal pattern is. And unless something shifts internally, the outcome cannot shift externally. Because new people can enter your life, but if your responses remain the same, the dynamic will eventually recreate itself. Different faces, same pattern, until awareness interrupts the cycle. Breaking the pattern does not start with other people. It does not start with changing who comes into your life. It starts much earlier than that. It starts with awareness. Because until awareness enters the picture, behavior stays automatic. And automatic behavior always recreates familiar outcomes. So instead of continuing the same question that keeps the cycle alive, why do I keep attracting the wrong people? The focus begins to shift inward. A more uncomfortable but more accurate question emerges. What am I signaling without even realizing it? Because every interaction carries signals. Not just words, but patterns of response. How quickly you explain yourself. How much emotional space you give. How long you stay in uncomfortable situations. How often you prioritize understanding over boundaries. All of these create a silent message that other people respond to, even if they don't consciously analyze it. And this is where change actually begins. Not by becoming colder, not by becoming disconnected, but by becoming more conscious in your responses. You start reducing unnecessary over-explaining. You stop over-giving just to maintain emotional balance. You begin to notice when you are trying to fix situations that don't require your emotional labor. And perhaps most importantly, you allow discomfort to exist without immediately trying to resolve it. Because for many empaths, discomfort has always meant fix it quickly. But in this stage, discomfort becomes something different. It becomes information. And slowly, through these small internal shifts, something subtle begins to change in your overall presence. Your energy no longer signals constant availability. It no longer signals automatic adjustment. It no longer signals unlimited emotional flexibility. Instead, it becomes more grounded, more intentional, more selective. And the most important part is this: it doesn't become softer. It becomes stronger. Your aura was never the problem. What you naturally carry, your presence, your energy, your emotional depth, none of that is the issue. Your openness was not a weakness either, and your empathy was never a flaw. In fact, these are qualities that allow you to understand people in ways most others cannot. But the real issue was something far more subtle. It was the lack of filtering. Because empathy on its own is powerful. But empathy without boundaries becomes exhausting. It creates space where everything is absorbed, whether it should be or not. And that is where imbalance begins. Not because empathy is wrong, but because it is unprotected. When there is no internal filter for what you allow into your emotional space, everything gets in. People's emotions, their instability, their expectations, their unresolved patterns, and over time that creates confusion and fatigue. But when awareness enters the picture, something shifts. You begin to understand that empathy is not meant to be unlimited access. It is meant to be conscious. Because empathy without boundaries invites imbalance. But empathy combined with awareness creates